All right, we'll start in 40 seconds. 40 seconds. Write it down so fast. Fifteen seconds. Silence is a good discipline. All right, let's pray. Lord, we do thank you so much for your word and the many good things you have given to us. We thank you for giving us life and breath, and we thank you for giving us new life in Christ, and for all the resources you have supplied for us and to us to meet all our needs, and so that we might serve you and be active members of your kingdom. So we do pray that you would help increase Grace Covenant Baptist Church's fruitfulness and the fruitfulness and faithfulness of all your churches all over the world. We ask this in Jesus' name and for his glory. Amen. All right, we're on week 5. Week 5. Did I change the number? I didn't change the number. We're on week 5 of our trek through common myths and misinterpretations, New Testament edition. Today is a little bit different. Today's class really could have fit. So I have planned four of these classes, these 6 weeks, myth and misinterpretations, one New Testament, one Old Testament, one in theology in general, and one in church history, one for church history. But today's class really could have fit either in Old Testament as well, or even in the theology class. But we popped it in New Testament, and it'll be a little bit different than what we've done in the past for the last 4 weeks, because we have primarily zoomed in on one particular verse that tends to get misinterpreted, or where a common misinterpretation has become very popular, either inside the church or outside the church. And then we drilled in and asked the question, what is this actually saying? We want to take seriously that the Bible is God's speech. He has communication intent, just like we do when we speak. So he means things. We can't just pop anything we want into his words. We want to understand what he has to say. And so we practiced good interpretation, which really just means reading slowly and carefully, and in one sense just treating God's word the way we want our words to be treated, taking them for the intent. And so we did that for the first 4 weeks. Today, we don't have, we do kind of, but we don't have a particular verse that we're going to spend the majority of our time unpacking. And there's a reason for this. So today's topic is what I've written in a sentence. Christians are commanded to give 1/10 of their income to church, or what you otherwise know as the tithe. The tithe. If you ask the average person on the street, what is a tithe? I think most people give an answer. What definitions do you think you'd get if you asked the average, even non-church going person on the street, what is a tithe? Jose. Giving money to the church. I think that's probably the answer you get. You're giving money to your church, and if you're really kind of up there literate, you probably know, and at least the word comes from the idea of a tenth. And either traditionally or even very strictly, some churches, that is sort of the base rule. When I was growing up, I worked in a place that had a copy machine for younger people. This used to be a thing that, you would go and you would get copies made either at a place that was dedicated to that, like a Kinko's, or sometimes there was just copy machines at random unrelated businesses that people could come in and pay to use. That was not a thing people had access to at their homes. And I worked at a place, and one time this old lady came in, and she was making copies, and I was helping her work the machine. Oh, what are you making copies of? And she was making copies of all, and I was 15 at the time, so I don't remember all the technical details, but it was financial documents, bank statements, pay stubs, I don't know, something like that. But she was making copies of that stuff so she could turn it in to her church so they could tell her how much she was supposed to give. And I remember thinking at the time, really on, but from her perspective, like I'm supposed to give 10%, and the maybe figuring that all out is more math and stuff than I want to do. So I'll just give my financial stuff to the church, and then they can tell me exactly how much money I owe for this year. Um, but and maybe some of us immediately go, well, that sounds horrible and abusive, potentially, or maybe she just really did want to give. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe she just really did want to give and really didn't want to deal with math, and so someone was helping her out. But it does potentially sound authoritarian and of draconian. Either way, there is this common idea in Christendom, depending on what denominational background you've been in, depending on what circles you run, there is a common idea that 10% of your income you are commanded to give to the church. That is a divine command. You're commanded to give 10% of your income to the church. Now, we understand Orthodox Christians, no matter what stripe, no matter what their position is on tithing, everyone understands that this is not saving in any sense. You're not justified by tithing, that you do not have your right standing with God by tithing. No. So even people who take a very, very strict line on tithing don't construe it as, good works righteousness in the sense of I'm earning any favor by God. So we don't want to be unfair to any particular view. But there is sometimes this idea that, well, even though it doesn't earn us our standing with God, it's like do not murder and do not lie, right? By not lying, we don't earn our right standing with God, but that still is an expectation. It's still an expectation of good behavior. It's still an expectation of God's moral will. And so giving 10% of your income to the church is the expectation for God's moral will. So we're going to nuance this a little bit. As we said, there are times as we have trekked through this that, as we've trekked through our various myths and misinterpretations, that you've got, maybe one thing a little off, you've got something a little unbalanced, you've got things where the outside world is misinterpreting what the church is saying. And here's one where if you do believe that it is a binding moral obligation to give exactly, or at least at minimum, 10% of your income to the church, I don't want to poo-poo your conscience. Nor do I want people to give less. In fact, hopefully you'll see by the end of this class the burden on you maybe is raised. Just as Jesus did when he said, you're not just supposed to not murder, you're not supposed to hate your brother in your heart. You're not just supposed to not commit adultery, you're not supposed to lust. So in a very real sense, the stakes were raised in Matthew and in the Sermon on the Mount. And in a very real sense, I think as we consider the tithing, both in the New and in the Old Testament, and theologically, there is maybe a little bit of a bigger burden than we thought. But like all of Jesus' burdens, it is joyful and it is light, and he carries them with us. Now, I mentioned, if you were not here right in the beginning, that we don't have a particular verse. We do kind of, but we're not unpacking a particular verse the way we have in the past, and there's a reason for this. Can anyone think of, off the top of your head, a New Testament command to tithe? Anyone? I would be suspicious if hands went up at this point, because there is no New Testament command to tithe in those words, like you are to bring your tithes to the church. The closest we get, which is a verse that some people do appeal to, is in Hebrews 7. And we're not going to spend the most of our time here, but if you want, we could pop over to Hebrews 7. And if you remember what's going on in the book of Hebrews in general, Jesus is being compared to a number of things. Jesus is being compared to angels. He's being compared to Melchizedek. And what's kind of the rhetorical point of Hebrews? Jesus is what relative to those things? He's greater. He's better. He's better. Better angel, better priest, better man. Jesus is better than all these things. So in Hebrews 7, where we're introduced to Melchizedek, the king priest of Salem, we are given this description starting in chapter 7, verse 1, goes all the way through verse 10, but we're told how Abraham gave a tenth of the spoils to Melchizedek. And the descendants of Levi receive the priestly, starting in verse 5, the descendants of Levi who receive the priestly office have a commandment in the law to take tithes from the people, that is, from their brothers, though these are also descended from Abraham. So the rhetorical point here is this comparison with Abraham and with Melchizedek. So Abraham gave a tenth to Melchizedek, and then Abraham's descendants received a tenth from their fellow descendants, from their brothers. And he says, but this man who does not have his descent from them received tithes from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. It is beyond dispute that the inferior is blessed by the superior. So you see the rhetorical point. Abraham must be inferior because of Melchizedek receiving tithes from Abraham, because of Melchizedek blessing Abraham. In the one case, tithes are received by mortal men, but in the other case, by one of whom it is testified that he lives. That is the key verse that many people appeal to. In context, the rhetorical point is that Melchizedek is greater than Abraham. Right at that exact moment, that's the main rhetorical point. Melchizedek is greater than Abraham. In one case, tithes are received by mortal men, but in the other case, of one of whom it is testified that he lives. Some people take that directly as a reference to Jesus. Other people say, well, no, he's talking about Abraham, or he's talking about Melchizedek. That's the one whom he lives. But this, of course, is typological. Melchizedek is pointing forward to Christ. So either way, the point is, if you're going to be paying tithes just to the Levites, to that kind of temporary priesthood that was ultimately inferior, how much more should we be paying tithes to the high priest of the new covenant, the one to whom Melchizedek typified, the one to whom Melchizedek and his kingly priestly office was pointing forward to? How much more should we pay tithes to Jesus? That's the logic that when people who appeal to that verse. So we paid tithes to the Levites, we paid tithes in the Old Testament, we got to pay tithes in the New Testament because Jesus is greater, he equally deserves the tithe. But then that raises the question, so we aren't given a strict New Testament practical, you are commanded to give X, Y, and Z, you're commanded to give 10%, and this is how you do it, and in what form. We're not given that. So what we have is a more theological argument. And that's fine. Just because we don't have a New Testament command to tithe doesn't mean that we aren't supposed to tithe. Doesn't mean that we aren't supposed to, in fact, do that. There are many things that the New Testament doesn't explicitly command, that it expects you to understand, expects you to get either from the Old Testament or just in the course of reading. You're supposed to understand implications, applications. That's normal. Just because we don't have a strict command doesn't immediately rule out the idea that we're supposed to tithe. But it does mean then, if it's the tithing command and the tithing idea is built on this sort of theological edifice, right? This sort of theological structure about the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament, right? Because that's what's happening in Hebrews. We've got this relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And everyone parses this a little bit differently. You know this, and we'll talk about this more in the future someday, but we've got many options for our big picture view of how the Old Testament and the New Testament relate to each other in the wider Christian church. You've got it's sometimes been described as systems of continuity and systems of discontinuity. How much discontinuity do you see between the two, and how much continuity do you see between the two? And so if in some systems you see very, very strict continuity between the Old Testament and the New Testament, and so it makes a natural sense that yes, absent the tithe being abrogated, absent God saying there's no tithe, we would, in the New Testament, we would say, okay, well, what are the parallel institutions? How do the types work? How do the lines draw up? What is the fulfillment in the New Testament of shadows and types in the Old Testament? And then we carry that over. So if there's a tithe in the Old Testament, we say, well, what is the tithe in the New Testament? Who pays the tithe? Who's the tithe being paid to? What is its purpose? And we see what are the fulfillment of these things in the New Testament, and then we can just kind of carry that over. And that works as far as it goes, but it means then that we have to really, if we're going to understand tithing in the New Testament, we have to understand it in the Old Testament. If we want to understand, I'm not going to settle any sort of specific grand theological relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament. I'm not going to parse all the different options that exist, but assuming that the Old Testament and the New Testament are organically connected, and that if you're going to, that it is possible to see the fulfillment from the Old Testament to the New Testament, assuming that, that means absent super clear statements in the New Testament of this is how this is to work out, you need to have a pretty good understanding of the Old Testament. Which is why we're actually going to camp today in the Old Testament to understand if we're going to word our obligation as Christians, our financial obligations, our giving obligations as Christians, if we're going to word that and understand that correctly, especially if we're making that an application of Old Testament tithing law, then we need to understand Old Testament tithing law to make sure we're doing that. So does anyone know off the top of their head, in the law, in the Pentateuch, in the Mosaic Law, a tithing passage? If not, that's fine. There are really three. There are three main ones, and we'll flip open to these. We'll have a few people flip to different ones. We'll have a few groups. So this group just kind of, we'll give this whole side, can just flip to Leviticus 27, starting in verse 30. This one's short, Leviticus 27, 30 and 33. So this group, this whole side can take this. And then we'll say the back half, starting with Olivia and Jillian. And behind, you guys can flip to Numbers 18, starting in verse 21. Numbers 18, starting in verse 21. And then my front half of this side, Samuel, and forward, you guys can flip to Deuteronomy 14. Yes, Deuteronomy 14, starting in verse 22. So go ahead and flip to these passages. These are the three main passages that legislate, that talk about actual expectations and laws concerning tithing. Now, we said this, but what does tithe mean? It means a tenth. And this is one of those cases where maybe, unfortunately in some senses, the presence of the word tithe in English is a little misleading sometimes, potentially, because it sounds like a technical term. It sounds like there is this thing, like the tithe that existed, but it is just the word for tenth in Hebrew. As we'll see in these passages, and when it says things like you are to bring your tithe, it says like literally you're to take a tenth. You're to take a tenth of whatever we're dealing with in the context, and that might make a difference, as we'll see as we start to dive in to these passages. So the first one, Leviticus 27, which is our kind of main summary. There's actually not a lot of detail here, but our main kind of summary, and it's also the first canonically of our tithing laws in the Pentateuch. Someone from this group who's got Leviticus 27, starting in verse 30, read all the way through 33 for me. Who's going to be bold and do it? Lisa, awesome. Yes. Every tithe of the land, whether the seed of the land or the fruit of the trees, is the Lord's. It's holy to the Lord. So what we'll do is we'll just try to start cataloging. We'll do it here in Leviticus 27, 30 through 33. We'll just start cataloging just some of the elements, some of what's going on. Let's actually just build a picture of what's happening with tithing. And so in this case, this is one of those examples. So every tithe of the land, every tenth, right? Every tenth of the land. So what's happening? What's happening in Leviticus? If you were to summarize tithing just from Leviticus, from those verses, what's going on in those verses. People who have it in front of them, more pressure is on you to answer. Say that again. Okay, so you've got things that you grow or raise. That's a good observation. Things that you grow or raise. So produce and livestock. Produce and livestock. Lexi? Oh, yeah, so that's interesting. So someone, it says, right, if you got that in front of you, it says, if a man wishes to redeem some of his tithe, he shall add a fifth to it. What does that mean? What is it talking about? Huh? Uh, Not necessarily. What's going on? If what does that mean to redeem your tithe and add a fifth to it, Danny? Yeah, yeah. So redeeming would be taking it back. And so what does this mean? What redeem the tithe and add a fifth to it? What would that be? Describe it. Yeah. Not necessarily connected even specifically with the firstborn, but that was also an occasion we were giving and making offerings to the Lord. But this is almost unintelligible. Some of the ways that we tend to think about the tithes, if you hadn't actually made Lisa's observation first, that what's being talked about in Leviticus is the stuff you grow, the stuff you raise, right? If it's your money, this makes no sense, but it's not. It's talking about the stuff you grow and the stuff you raise. So you're supposed to take every tenth, right? But if for some reason you wanted that tenth, like, oh, I really want this cow. I really want, I don't want to give this cow. That's okay. You can buy it back by paying its value plus a fifth. So you get to keep the cow, and then money instead goes, right? Like that doesn't make sense if it's money. It only makes sense, granted, we're talking about things that you grow and raise in this text, right? Other things that go on are happening just in Leviticus about the tithe. Just our observations. Stuff you grow and raise. We're not dealing with specifically with money there. Yes, it is the Lord's, right? Belongs to God. That's huge. You can't skip that. Belongs to the Lord. And another way it says that is it is holy. It is holy. Other things. Jumping off, tip your fingers, you want to say? If not, that's okay. Let's pop over then. So we've got this kind of broad picture summary of the tithe in Leviticus 27 right at the end. It's one here, at least. It's the stuff you grow and you raise. We're not actually dealing with money. It's stuff you grow and you raise because you can buy it back with money if you wanted to. And it belongs to the Lord. It's holy. Now, Leviticus there doesn't exactly tell us what we're supposed to do with it, right? It doesn't tell us what that means. What does it mean that it belongs to God? How do you give it to God? What does that look like? What actually happens with the tithe, right? Does it, just float away into heaven? You say, "This is yours, God," and it descends into no, right? The Leviticus doesn't tell us, so we have to go elsewhere. Let's do the Numbers one first. So, who is in my back group that has Numbers? You're at Numbers 18, starting in 21. This passage goes on, so we'll do 21 to 24. Who will read Numbers 21 to 24 out loud? Jillian, thank you. All right, so what's going on in this passage? What kind of what are some features that are adding to our understanding of tithing? What's going on here? Samuel. Right? So the Levites receive it. The Levites receive the tithe. And one of the things, we're going to talk about this a little more in just a few minutes, is a big question in terms of reading the Old Testament is how many tithes? How many tithes were there? We think, like, oh yeah, the tithe. But remember, tithe is not a technical term in the Old Testament. It just means the tenth. So if I tell you, hey, I want you to take a tenth of your money and do this. I want you to take a tenth of your money and do B. I want you to take a tenth of your money and do C. That could mean I want you to take 1/10 for job A, 1/10 for job B, and 1/10 for job C, which would be 3/10, right? Or it could mean I want you to take that tenth and split it up among these three things. Right? Those are two very different ideas. And so one of the questions is how many times, how many tenths were taken and apportioned in the Old Testament? We'll come back to that question. So the Levites receive it. My only point in bringing that up at this point is I think we're on good grounds to understand that this is not separate from what we just read in Leviticus. Theoretically, it could have been. There's a tenth for the Lord, and then another tenth for the Levites. But we know that this is the same Y. Y from Numbers 18, is this the same? You're staring at Numbers 18. And if we're at Numbers 18, you're free to turn there, my Leviticus people. Jason. Well, so there's that. I've given every tithe. Um, uh, and so verse 21 and verse 24. What's going on in verse 24 that I'm thinking of? Yeah. So this tithe is still viewing this very much as something given to the Lord, right? So this is something given to the Lord. So we're not offering an alternative to here. So there's some tenth that goes to the Lord, and there's some tenth that goes to the Levites here. This tenth that goes to the Levites is still considered going to the Lord. So we've got a tenth that goes to the Lord. Why does a tenth go to the Levites? Are they just better than everyone? Uh, Lexi. Yeah, they don't get any inheritance in the land, as it says here, and it goes on to elaborate because then even the Levites have responsibilities and expectations with what they receive. They were to tithe on top of the tithe, and that went specifically to the temple, to the priestly ministry, because remember, not all Levites were priests. What were the Levites relative to the whole Levitical priestly system? Yeah, everything else, everything else besides the very, very specific, because temple personnel is more than just the priest. There's all sorts of things that need to be happening. So if we were to make a modern analogy, not that I'm saying there's a one-to-one here, but there's the people who work at the church, your pastors and your ministers, but then there's, depending on the size of the church, lots of other staff that a church needs to run, and they're not all pastors just because they're on the payroll of the church. In the same way, you've got the priest, but not everyone who works in the temple and there's lots of stuff that has to be done in the temple besides the priestly activity. The Levites did all that. Only the sons of Aaron specifically were the priests, and the Levites, the wider tribe, did also everything else. So the Levites don't get an inheritance, and they receive the tithes as a way of supporting them. All right, now we'll just pop a pin in that for just a second. Now let's head over to Deuteronomy 14. Deuteronomy 14, and we're starting in verse 22, and let's go through just 27 for now. So someone read me Deuteronomy, someone whose last name isn't Pittman, read me Deuteronomy 14, verses 22 through 27. All right, Juliet. All right. So if you got your eyes on Deuteronomy 14, in verse 22, everyone can be there now since we moved on. What are some elements of the tithe that are happening, or at least of tithing in general? We'll kind of come to the question of whether we're dealing with one or more than one tithe. But what are some elements of tithing in Deuteronomy 14? Things that we are going to draw from Deuteronomy 14 that are true of tithing. Yeah. So really, two things there, right? To be enjoyed, by you. Yeah, you partook. Right? You're giving something to God, but you eat it. How's that giving something to God? How's me giving my cow to God? How's me eating it, giving it to God? We'll talk about that in a second. But so it's enjoyed by you, and it's eaten in a particular place. Where? Jerusalem, right? It's eaten in Jerusalem. What else? Or another question we might ask, narrowing, why? Why particularly that one? What does Deuteronomy have to say? Yeah, right? So we're given this purpose statement to learn to fear the Lord, to learn to fear God. How? Why? Why does that work? Why is this law going to help the people learn to fear God? Yeah. So it forces trust and provision. That's one of the things. Like that's one of the thing is harder for us non-agrarian where we're not ourselves so directly producing. Like I mean, some of you have gardens. Like my dad has a wonderful garden. He grows and he eats what he grows. I don't do that. I'm so far removed from my food. It's you don't necessarily think of eating as trust. But if you're actually growing the things, and particularly meat, particularly your cattle, which also did all sorts of other things besides just provided food, you have to trust. Part of what's going on in the tithe is a forced consumption where you trust God is going to provide more. You eat this, God says. You eat this and you enjoy it, and I promise I'm going to provide more. So there is a forced trust in God's provision. What else? How does this help us to learn to fear the Lord? Alexi. Yeah, one part of this is a revelation of God's character, getting to know God more, right? Getting to know God. And sometimes if you hadn't been thinking about tithing in a while and you read Deuteronomy, it's like one of those passages that feels like people forget. I mean, look the way he talks here, right? If it's too long, if the way is too long, right, you have to go to Jerusalem. And if it's too long, and like taking all the produce and the animals, that's going to be logistically a nightmare. It says you can sell it. You can turn it into money. So sell the stuff, take it into money. Then you take the money in your hand and you go to Jerusalem and you spend the money for whatever you want. Oxen, sheep, wine, strong drink, right? And, like some Baptists cringe, but he says, you go buy, whatever you want. Listen to this phrase, whatever your appetite craves. That almost sounds unbiblical. It just sounds like a sinful phrase. Whatever your appetite craves, and you shall eat there before the Lord your God and rejoice, you and your household. So this is a revelation of God's goodness. I saw another hand, Esther. Say that again. Yeah. Do you want to unpack that at all? So all of that. So there's this reminder of your provision, and there's this act of obedience, and all of that is key to the fact that you have to travel to Jerusalem. Right? That has a very practical point. You have to go. This is a public show of allegiance. You're acknowledging where everything you have comes from. You're gathering together to worship. You are making a public show of your fealty to the one true God. So this localizing of bringing the tithes was a very important aspect. You're learning to fear God. You're learning to acknowledge Him as the source of your provision. You're making a public show of your loyalty, very much in the tradition of when vassal kingdoms were under a greater kingdom, they had to bring their tributes. That's what this is. You're bringing your tributes. You have to actually travel. You have to actually go to God and bring your tributes. Now, again, you get to enjoy them. You get to eat them there with Him. And it also says you give to the Levites. You don't forget the Levites, but you get to go. You get to enjoy. You get to eat and enjoy God's presence. He's not a grumpy king that you're like afraid of. You get to go and bring your tributes and enjoy it there. Was there a hand? Paul. Yes. So now it starts to make sense as you think about that purpose statement to learn to fear the Lord, right? All of this is for you to learn to fear God. I think I saw Jason's hand, then Jose. Was it not you? No. Oh, Danny. Was it Danny's hand? Yeah. Yep. And then Jose. Yeah. And so uh, here is where, especially, people tend to distinguish two tithes. They say this is a separate tithe than this tithe. There's the tithe you consume, and there's the tithe you give to the Levites, which might sound artificially drawing a line when we use that language tithe, but if you say it with just the math, then it sounds fine. You give a tenth to the Levites, you give a tenth that you consume. And so then that becomes a question. Is there two tithes, or is there one tithe? And actually, the question is there one, two, or three? Because Deuteronomy goes on, it says, at the end of every 3 years, you shall bring out all the tithe of your produce of the same year and lay it up within your towns. And the Levite, because he has no portion or inheritance with you, and the sojourner, the fatherless, and the widow, who are within your town, shall come and eat and be filled, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of the hands that you do. What in that section, in 28 and following of Deuteronomy 14, what element of the tithe is mentioned, or at least of this tithe that we haven't yet talked about? What is the tithe doing? Yeah, right? Providing for the poor, disadvantaged. So here's another element. Providing for poor. We'll just put that there. And so then that's a question. Is that an alternative to one of the earlier tithes, or is this every 3rd year there is a third tithe? So then the question is, like, so what percentage of your produce are you actually giving? Is it 10%? Is it 20%? or is it every 3 years, 30%? In which case, which a lot of people do, I don't, if you've ever heard this number before, depending on what circles you run in, that the biblical tithe was actually 23.5% of your income over 3 years, because you're giving for 2 tithes, and then every third year you have a third tithe. And so the math works out to be about 23.5%. So you'll see that number all over the place in literature about tithing, like that's the actual number. Not 100% sure. Not 100% sure. I tend to lean towards this is one tithe. This is one tithe, and there are multiple things that you do with that 10%. Some people argue like, well, if you're enjoying your 10%, that won't be able to support the Levites. This has to be a separate tithe. I think that vastly underestimates or overestimates how much you can eat if you bring a bull. Eh, the Levites, were 22. So we don't know exactly over all the time of Israel, but if we just grab some numbers from Numbers, the book of Numbers, the Levites were 22,000 out of 622,000, so that's about 3.5%. They're 3.5% of the people. So if they're receiving 10%, and you like, this is an oversimplification, but if they're receiving 10% and every person gets only one portion, like they only have enough for them, then everyone gets 0.9 of a portion, so they're still close enough. And the Levites are getting like 3 portions, right? So like if they're receiving 10%, they're getting 3 times as much as everyone else. So I definitely think no, 1/10 could do all of this, but then there is the fact that it's definitely more common for people to understand 2 tithes here. Certainly by the time of Jesus, all our literature from the time seems to recognize that, it's at least 20% was the expectation. There's 10% that goes to the Levites and the temple supporting, and 10% that is part of this kind of festival enjoyment that you're supposed to consume as an act of faith, as an act of fealty. Jim. Yeah, so that's a question. Most people would say probably the occasion is the festivals. That's your time. That's your time frame is the festivals, or any other case. But either way, the biblical tithe is 100, or at least the biblical expectation of giving was 100% more than 10%. It was no question, because not only did you have the tithe, so even if it is only one tithe, tithing is not the only situation where you give gifts and offerings. There are others that are not called the tenth. The tenth was just like a mandatory tenth. You gave this tenth, and that's shaved off the top. But then there were other gifts and offerings for other occasions that you had to give. And then there was a sort of mandatory poor giving in forced gleaning, meaning that's where you had to, with your fields, like what's gleaning? Does anyone know? Hmm? Yeah, it's when people would pick off the edges. And so when it's codified in the law, you weren't allowed to uh, to say it simply, you weren't allowed to pick everything. You took your pass or two, and then you had to let what was left be picked by anyone who wanted it. So there was all sorts of giving. So either way, whether you recognize more than one tithe here, as probably the majority do, whether you recognize only one tithe that is split up among these various things, all your giving in the Old Testament law amounted to more than 10%. It also didn't include money, right? We have as we've observed, tithing is never connected with money. It's always connected with produce and livestock. Some people say, well, that's because they were agrarians. Like, yeah, they were agrarian, but they still had money. It wasn't a bartering system. I mean, we read about money in the very same text. And so the point being, it's not so simple just to move from in the Old Testament, you had to give 10% of your income. So in the New Testament now, you need to give 10% of your income. Well, they were definitely giving more than 10%. Now, the exact figure might be hard to, but it could be as high as 23.5%. Some people calculate even higher. And there was much more involved than just giving. You had to travel to Jerusalem. You consumed at least a portion of what you gave, so it's still considered given, but you have to consume it. It has purpose statements, the things that are happening with the tithe? I saw a hand broke. Oh, Esther, go ahead. I said that in a kind of a rough analogy. I don't want to make too strong a direct parallel between temple and church because sometimes that's misleading. But that was my kind of rough analogy. Yeah. Well, so that becomes the question. So if we're going to do, even if we're going to do a one-to-one movement from the Old Testament to the New Testament, it's more than 10%. Now, however you're going to parse it, it's more than 10%. But I think probably better, and some people have done very good work on this. As you look, particularly Andreas Kostenberger and David Croteau, they wrote a couple articles on tithing and giving. And in their second article, they had a whole summary of like the New Testament teaching on giving. We don't have time to get into it now, but looking at various things, so principles for giving that they kind of systematize, and I'll just list these now. Like this is what the New Testament has to say about giving. It should be systematic, it should be proportional, it should be sacrificial, generous, should be intentional, should have proper motivation for love for others, desire for reciprocity, should have an eye towards reward from God. Again, these are all things in the New Testament. It should be done out of love. We should want to give out of ourselves out of love. There should be an eye towards needs being met. There is a desire for divine blessing. There should be a cheerfulness, and it should be voluntary. It shouldn't be forced. And so if anyone wants that, I can give that to them and with all the passages. I can even give you the whole article. But so there is this kind of summary of the New Testament, what the New Testament has to say about giving. And I think better is to look at, well, already, not better, it's a massive oversimplification to say the Old Testament commanded you to give 10% of your income. It's not true, and it's not that simple. Uh, but as we look in the New Testament, we want to ask, so what was the purpose? What was the intent behind the tithe? What was the things that the tithe was supposed to do? We've already identified them. The tithes provided for the temple ministry. It made sure that it was able to exist. The tithe provided for the poor. It took care of them. The tithes provided an occasion for you to come before the Lord and to learn to fear him. And they were enjoyed by you. They were given as an act of faith. They were engendered your own trust as you had suffered a forced loss, but you also learned God's character as the good provider. So all of these things, as we come to the New Testament, as we come to our era in the New Covenant, should be applicable to our giving. And remembering that even in the Old Testament, it was more than 10%, right? Applicable in the New Testament, and that, like, we do. Like, you don't want to overstate the parallels because the New Testament fulfillment of the temple is the church, the body, not the this building, right? But for an actual local church ministry, requires funds to exist. So just as in the Old Testament, you wanted to support the existence of actual ministry, well, we want to give so that we can support ministry. We also want to give so that we can take care of the poor. And we also want to set some of our money aside to not be misers and to enjoy God's good provision, and particularly relative to our life together as a church. You couldn't mail your time, right? You couldn't hire someone and have them take, let's say you give 50%. I'm so generous. I'm giving 50% of my animals, I'm loading them all up, or I'm selling them and I'm getting the money, and I sent it to Jerusalem. That doesn't fly, right? Like that doesn't work. You can sit home and write a check for 90% of your income, and if you never show up to church, you never participate, you're never enjoying fellowship, you're never coming under the ministry, you're never gathering together, that's not tithing, right? Like that it doesn't work. That's not what the tithe was about. The tithe wasn't just about receiving money. It was about all of these things. And so as we want to have a New Testament principles for giving, as seen summarized by Kostenberger and Courteau, we can look back at the Old Testament and we can see what is the purpose of the tithe. One, it wasn't limited to 10%, so already we have that. Two, it belongs to the Lord. It is holy to the Lord. But the ways we give that is that we look at our money, we take it, we give proportionally. It's sort of forced giving, a forced sacrifice, but this helps me trust the Lord. Part of that would be how I uh, make my life, right? Make my life ordered around my church life. So one of the ways we might, I'll give you just some few examples. I don't even do all of these. So this is not like a rules, this is not prescriptions, but 100% we should be giving so that ministry could happen. I like that you guys pay me and I have a job. Right? Like, so that should happen. You should continue to give so that church ministry should happen. We should also give to things like the benevolence fund, specifically set aside money both as a church and as individuals so that the poor are taken care of. Again, dealing with the tithe. Another thing that you might do, which you can consider giving to the Lord, is the way you order your finances to make church life central, the way they had to travel to Jerusalem. So maybe you, it will have financial implications for us to order our life so that I can be at Sunday mornings and Sunday evenings and Wednesdays even. And I'll have financial implications. Or there are things that I can do with my finances to facilitate that. Maybe you eat out once a week. Make that Sunday so you don't have to worry about like cooking and energy. Like make Sunday your eating out day so that you can do Sunday evenings easier. Right? We just go out to eat for lunch, then we can come back to Sunday evenings, and that's built into our budget. We're giving that money to God. We're not worrying about like, oh, are we being wasteful eating out? Like, no, we're going to go out on Sunday so that we can go back to Sunday evenings easier. Or whatever it might be. Maybe it requires taking a loss, and that is your sense of giving for whatever your type of work is. Like, oh, if I have to come on Wednesdays, that will involve taking a loss. Well, that can be considered what you are giving financially, because part of the tithe was about getting the people into actual gathered worship so that they could express their fealty to the Lord. So if you're just giving money, you're not doing that. The point of the tithe is using your finances to order your life around your identity as God's people, and the visible expression of God's people, the local church. So you want to make sure that church ministry can happen. You want to provide for it with your giving. You want to make sure that the poor are taken care of, and you want to order your life so that you can participate and do whatever it takes financially to make that possible. All right. We've gone longer than we usually do, so let's go ahead and close. Lord, we do thank you so much for everything that you have given to us, and we just pray that we would be good stewards of it, that we would give back to you cheerfully, that we would trust you, that we would not be miserly, but trust that you are good and you do provide, so that we can have ministry, so that the poor among us can be taken care of, and so that we can come together and enjoy the fruits of that ministry, enjoy all the good things that you have promised to do in the life of your church. So help us as a people to grow in faithfulness to give and to prioritize that. We pray in Jesus'